Insights, solutions, and networking all come together at RSA Conference. Join a global cybersecurity community at rsaconference.com/ITSP-MAG24.
And hello, everybody. You are very welcome to a new episode of Redefining CyberSecurity podcast. And this is your host, Sean Martin. As you know, I get to talk about all kinds of cool things with cool people who know much more than me about lots of things cyber. And today is certainly no different. This is a topic that I've had a conversation on it a number of times from a number of different perspectives, and it's a topic I wanted to chat with Harley about for a while, and we finally connected, and Harley connected us with Katie, and here we are. We're going to be talking about the state of vulnerability, I'll say assessments, and then ultimately the disclosure process. So how are organizations looking at that? How do laws, more importantly, impact how organizations do that, and even more importantly, how researchers are able or not able to help organizations do that. So we're going to get into that topic. I'm really excited about it. Before we do, though, I'd like to welcome Katie and Harley. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep, it's going to be fun. And maybe a few words from each of you before we get started. Maybe a little bit about your role, what you're up to, why this topic is important, or at least of interest to you. So Katie, we'll start with you.
Okay, wonderful. I always prefer it when Harley starts, but I'm happy to jump in. So I'm Katie Noble. I am the Director of Product Security and Communications at Intel Corporation. I've been with Intel for about 4 years. Previous to that, I was in the U.S. government for about 15 years, where I was responsible for all of the U.S. government's portfolios on vulnerability disclosure. So that's the MITRE CVE program, the NIST NVD program, the Carnegie Mellon CERT CC program, and the ICS CERT vulnerability handling program. So during my tenure, I have coordinated and disclosed about 20,000 cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So I absolutely love vulnerability disclosure. It's sort of key to who I am as a person, and security is something that I think is a defining point in the ecosystem that we live in. So that's me.
I love it. 20,000. My goodness, that's a few. Harley.
So I'm Harley Geiger, and I'm a cybersecurity attorney at Venable LP, which is a law firm. And I work there on cybersecurity laws, policies. I help folks manage cybersecurity incidents and stay compliant with cybersecurity and data protection laws. I also coordinate the Hacking Policy Council, which is a group of companies that are driven by creating a better policy and legal environment for things like vulnerability management, vulnerability disclosure, bug bounties, and vulnerability assessment. I've been working on this issue for more than 10 years at this point, back before things like ethical hacking or vulnerability disclosure were nearly as common as they are now. And I care about it because ultimately I think that this is about protecting consumers. I think that having a decentralized way of finding and disclosing vulnerabilities so that they can be patched before criminals get at them is ultimately going to benefit users. And on the flip side of that, for the folks that are finding the vulnerabilities and disclosing them, I think that protections for them are important because ultimately this is about whether or not we are able to use computers in ways that are unexpected. And if we're trying to do the right thing, I think that it's important that we continue to have that ability as people who are growing up with computers all around us increasingly.
I love it. So I want to start with maybe a definition of a few things. So you both mentioned coordinated vulnerability disclosure. There are a few laws I want to get into as well, maybe some that have passed, maybe some that are in the works. Who wants to kind of set the stage with what coordinated vulnerability disclosure is and its role within protecting our society and the businesses that make our society run, and governments, I guess, as well?
I can start if you want.
Yeah.
So when we look at vulnerability disclosure, it's helpful to kind of take a step back and say, what is a cybersecurity vulnerability? We use this term vulnerability kind of in normal, everyday English conversation. And I sort of think that we use it as a noun. But in the cybersecurity context, we're actually using it more as an adjective. And so vulnerability in the cybersecurity context is a weakness in a device that allows an attacker to do something the developer didn't originally intend. There are lots of definitions that are very formal. ISO has a definition of it. CVE has a definition of it. But I think ultimately it comes down to a device is being used in a way that was not intended by the original developer, which can cause harm. So that's your structure of what a vulnerability is. There are physical vulnerabilities and there are cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And so we live mostly in the cybersecurity realm. So then when we say coordinated vulnerability disclosure, sometimes you hear coordinated vulnerability disclosure or vulnerability disclosure programs, VDP. These terms are often used interchangeably, and they are, for the most part, similar. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure is your overall umbrella. It's a process that has international standards assigned to it. Most big industry companies comply to those international standards. And what it truly means is that it is a toolbox for receiving vulnerabilities from anywhere, internal, external, doesn't matter. Sometimes we have friendly hackers who send us stuff. We get a lot of data that way. Sometimes we have internal red teams that find vulnerabilities. So vulnerability disclosure is a way of receiving those vulnerabilities, processing them. So we're identifying, mitigating, and disclosing. Your ultimate output of a vulnerability disclosure program or a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program is a disclosure. And that is usually accompanied by a patch. And so when you see on your iPhone that your phone needs to be updated because you've got a new patch or any kind of device, that is ultimately the process has worked from the beginning to the end. So that's the whole process is represented there. And you're as a customer being presented with the output of that process.
And Harley, I'd like your take on this as well, maybe from an organization perspective. Because I heard Katie describe two things. One is internal evaluations. Other is public that come through CVEs, perhaps. And then I know you discussed or mentioned bug bounties as well, which could be a third piece of the pie. Are there others? And maybe a picture of how well organizations are addressing each of those areas. Are they good at some? Do some only look at CVEs and they think they're good, or kind of, you know what I'm saying? What's that picture look like?
So I think vulnerability disclosure and coordinated vulnerability disclosure are a subset of vulnerability management, right? So organizations are just required by law, many of them, to search for vulnerabilities and test for vulnerabilities in their assets. Those kinds of sort of internal testing and discovery and patching that stays in-house are not necessarily vulnerability disclosure, but qualifies as vulnerability management. But as part of that vulnerability management program, if a vulnerability is identified by somebody that is external from that normal process, it can be an employee within the same organization, but it could also be somebody outside of that organization, like a security researcher. What is the channel for communicating that to the team that can do something about it, that can assess the disclosure, figure out how serious it is, communicate back out and establish a patch? That is vulnerability disclosure. In addition, if the organization determines this is not my vulnerability, this belongs to another company, or another organization, then that organization may have a process for disclosing that to that other organization. So this is also within the bucket of coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies. And so increasingly, organizations are adopting the disclosure aspect of their vulnerability management program. I think it's becoming more accepted. In terms of how well they're doing it, it really varies. And it doesn't necessarily vary by size or resources either. I think it's just kind of whether the organization takes it seriously and has put the effort forth to establish a good process. Importantly, it's not just the organization having that channel. Right. It's not just can we receive vulnerabilities? It also has to be that back end assessment and triaging and communication. If you don't have that back end process in place, which is usually part of a vulnerability management program, then your vulnerability disclosure policy is not going to be very impactful. Disclosures may languish. In terms of the sort of the legal landscape of it, there are an increasing number of laws that require it, and even more guidelines, best practices, standards, things like that, that encourage vulnerability disclosure policies. We can get into some of the specifics about that, but I think that the broadly adoption is increasing. We're not taking steps backwards.
And I will add one little thing to it as well. Vulnerability disclosure, the intent of a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program is really to reduce adversarial risk. So the idea being that the vulnerability is identified from wherever it's identified. It's communicated to the vendor who has the most, the vendor or the end user, I guess, the person who has the most ability to say, let me rephrase that, the vendor or the owner operator. The end user is different. The person who has the most ability to fix it. And then there's somewhat of an agreement that happens, and that's called embargo. And so what happens there is that the identifier and the person who's doing the fixing both agree that no one will talk about this until everyone can talk about this. And the idea being that that reduces adversarial risk. If vulnerability is disclosed, that's called a zero-day vulnerability disclosure, and it's usually not a good thing because it means that an adversary has the ability to leverage that vulnerability before the end user has the ability to patch it. And so that's the idea of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Everyone kind of agrees to this process so that everyone can reduce the overall risk for the entire community. And that's the defensive nature of coordinated vulnerability disclosure.
Yeah, I appreciate you adding that. Go ahead, Harley.
We're sort of talking about it in dry terms, but I think that it's a really interesting process because we're talking about people who are finding vulnerabilities in systems, sometimes by testing it and putting themselves at some legal risk by coming forth and talking to this organization like, hey, I was messing around on your system and I found that you are vulnerable, and I found the social security numbers of a bunch of, let's just use a random example, educators from the Department of Education, and this results in the governor of the state telling you that you've been hacking and that this is a crime. Right, so it can lead to some really interesting outcomes, but if you're doing it right, there's a whole bunch of dry processes that are involved that are based on standards, that make sure everything goes smoothly. But it is actually a pretty wild space, which is one of the reasons I find it fun to work on.
And it's changed a lot in the last 10 years. It used to be the regular, kind of the norm for security researchers, hackers, as we lovingly call them. We tend to call them security researchers when we're being polite. And hackers is kind of the, friendly hackers, ethical hackers is sort of the phrase that they often use to define themselves. But there has been a big change in the last 10 years. Security researchers used to be served, legal notices and cease and desists, and it was a regular kind of thing. And if you're just a curious person, security researchers come in multiple different psychological flavors. And so their motivations are identified by a lot of different pieces. And of that, malicious nature is usually not one of them. And so to be confronted with this kind of cease and desist or legal ramifications is very chilling. And so we've seen over the last 10 years a very big change in mindset where a lot of big companies have adopted and said, hey, this is good for everybody. This is good for us. It's good for our competitors. It's good for our end users. It's good for everyone. If we can raise that noise floor, if we can lift the tide, then all ships go as well. And that ultimately makes everyone safer. And it sets a standard that others will you set the bar high and others will rise to it. And so that's kind of been the change that we've seen. We've also seen the big push in legal regulatory requirements. When the Department of Defense in 2015 launched Hack the Pentagon, that was a huge watershed moment for this kind of vulnerability disclosure, bug bounty, coordinated vulnerability disclosure push. It said the US government is serious about this and is going to do it to ourselves. Don't just do as I say, not as I do. And they were saying, we're going to do this and you should too. And I think that was a huge moment where other companies kind of realized, there's a lot of benefits to this. And this security research is happening whether we want it to or not. So why don't we take advantage of the opportunity? As many sets of eyes on a product can only make things better. So we have seen that big change recently, but there are still some who are uncomfortable with the idea, and I understand.
Yeah, I always, for years, I've said every organization's running a bug bounty program, whether they know it or not. So.
I would caveat that just a little. So the bug bounty program, because that's the nature of the bug bounty program is such that a reward is given for finding the vulnerability, and that can be very valuable. If it's deployed correctly, it can't take the place of a lot of other testing, but it can find vulnerabilities that might otherwise be missed by your in-house testing. But that is very different from a normal sort of just a bare bones coordinated disclosure policy because of the reward aspect. If a researcher comes to you and demands a reward, which sometimes happens, there's, I think, a growing expectation among researchers that they would be compensated for this effort, even if a bug bounty program is not in place. Then we start to get into territory where it doesn't look as much like good faith research. It can be misconstrued as extortion. And this is one of the things that we end up counseling both organizations and researchers on is, the approach and the expectations have to be aligned so that there's not a misunderstanding about whether this is a bug bounty program or whether, this is just a coordinated disclosure.
Yeah. I think that's why it's important for every organization to have a CVD, right? So that it's clearly defined what the rules are of engagement. So
yeah, there's a lot of different motivations for why a security researcher may do the things that they do. We kind of break them down into archetypes because that helps us identify which, from a company perspective, it helps us identify which kind of reward is going to be the most valuable to what kind of security researcher. And it's a sliding scale. People can be more than one type, but you have your professional bug hunters, and those are the folks that make a living off of bug bounty programs. They may hack on lots of different programs, and they're trying to find the best bang for their buck there, the easiest thing to find with the highest payout, right? So you're gonna build a program for them that targets them a little bit different than you may find a recognition seeker. So recognition seekers often tend to be academic institutions, and they don't care about money or oftentimes don't care about money. And in most cases can't accept a reward anyway. The thing that they're looking for is to be able to publish. So they want that recognition. They want to be able to say, I got a CVE was issued by X company, and this is the disclosure. They put that in their portfolio, and that helps them in their career aspirations, helps them in their security research for the academic institution that they're part of. So their motivations might be very different. They're very motivated by being able to talk about it, where a professional bug hunter may not care if it's ever been disclosed. They just got their payment and they move on. You also have your friendly organizations, your organizational helpers, we call them. That may be a company is doing their own internal security research, and they find a vulnerability that impacts another company, and they just kind of throw it over the fence and say, here you go, other company. But you also have government agencies. They tend to be friendly helpers too. They find things, they notify the company. So you do have several different kinds of security researchers, and it's often valuable whenever you're figuring out the mechanics of your vulnerability disclosure program, how to target which type of researcher and how to make sure you're not missing any potential security research that may be valuable for you.
Yeah, and Harley, Katie mentioned a lot of change in the, I'll say, the mindset and culture of this, where I think you even said it's more acceptable as well. So there's more willingness to understand the value and more willingness to put a CVD program in place and to participate in bug bounty programs and things like that. That's the organization side, and certainly we continue to see lots of activity on the researcher side. What about the laws that kind of sit in the middle, and most specifically, like DMCA, I think is one of the big ones that kind of potentially puts researchers in jeopardy. I think it still exists. There hasn't been much change with that, right? But are there other changes that make things better or worse for the researcher community?
I think most of the changes are in favor of the researcher community over the past 10 years in terms of law and regulation, not just business culture and in community practice, but the law and regulatory changes over the past 10 years have almost entirely favored more protection for good faith security research. There are still gaps. So you mentioned Section 1201 of the DMCA. This is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's a mouthful to say, right? Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, but it is in fact one of the United States' most important anti-hacking laws. It is also a law that has, I think, proven how kind of perilous it is to have like a broad technology law, because I think if it were introduced in Congress today, I don't think it would even get a hearing. It is aged, I think, very, very poorly. What it says is that it is illegal to circumvent a technological protection measure to a copyrighted work, which means any sort of security safeguard on software without the permission of the copyright owner of the software. So that includes copyright or programs that you yourself own. So if you have an IoT device, for example, and there's software that's on the IoT device, you might think, well, I can tinker with this a little bit for security research or for a disability access, things like that, or space shifting. It's essentially a DRM protection rule. But there are some exceptions, and those exceptions have slowly, like over the course of 9-10 years, have been expanded upon and built upon to where we now have better protection. I think not perfect, but quite good for security research. One of the gaps, though, is that is just for Section 1201, that exception. It doesn't apply to other areas of the law. But that was where, weirdly enough, in this obscure copyright proceeding, is where a lot of the cutting edge conversations were happening on security research or protection. The definition that they ended up coming up with in those proceedings for legal protections for security research have now been replicated in other parts of the regulatory ecosystem. So the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is far more famous than DMCA, but used, I think, less for security research, actually now has a charging policy associated with it. The Department of Justice announced this around the time that the Supreme Court ruled on CFAA in the Van Buren case, where they said that they urge prosecutors to decline to prosecute good faith security researchers if they're meeting this definition of good faith security research that's drawn from that copyright proceeding, the DMCA proceedings. So there's a lot of better. I think that the environment is better for researcher liability in those areas. Gaps that exist. Some of them are private lawsuits. Others are state laws. Those two areas have not evolved the same way that criminal liability has in the United States. There's also folks, I think we're still trying to figure out how those laws apply to research into AI. And we can talk about that in more depth, I think, later. But I want to also talk about on the company side, so on the software owner side, there are increasingly, as I mentioned, best practices, guidelines, and regulations that encourage or outright require the adoption of vulnerability disclosure. And so federal agencies right now, as an example, all are supposed to have vulnerability disclosure policies. If you look up, sort of pick your favorite federal agency and look up, vulnerability disclosure policy, you should be able to find one. This is new, and in a lot of ways, Katie mentioned hack the Pentagon, but I think the federal government has been very forward-leaning on adopting coordinated vulnerability disclosure. There's also executive orders and other laws related to federal contractors that require vulnerability disclosure. So outside of that, in Europe, in a couple of other sectoral laws like medical devices, having coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies are increasingly becoming required, not just encouraged. So yeah, the landscape is definitely changing. I think it's changing in favor of sort of institutionalizing and accepting this process of good faith security research and vulnerability disclosure. And we just, we're in a place where we're trying to plug some of the gaps now.
And I want to go to Katie in a second, but I want to stick with you mentioned state laws haven't quite caught up, and maybe Katie's shaking her head. Maybe she has some thoughts on this as well. But can you give an example of where is it? Where the company is? Is it where the researcher is? Does it matter? And what's the hampering part of a state law, if you have one handy to reference?
So in state laws, remember that state laws are not necessarily affected by changes to federal law, not always. So if you pass a federal law or change a federal law, unless you say this preempts state laws, then they are separate. So changes that happen to things like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act or the CFAA, those will stay within the realm of federal law and not necessarily affect state laws. Now, each state has their own computer crime law. And so even though we've seen sort of the federal space evolve to get more modern when it comes to security research or vulnerability disclosure, the states' laws have largely stayed stagnant. And in many cases, those laws are more broad than the things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So, for example, I was joking earlier in the podcast about finding educators' social security numbers and the governor calling it hacking. That happened in the state of Missouri. And technically in the state of Missouri, for some of the laws that prevent malicious hacking, there is not an intent requirement the same way that there is under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It's broader. So sort of regardless of your intent for some of those laws. In the state of Maryland, home of the NSA, if you are trying to find a password without authorization, like the act of seeking that password, trying to identify it, is technically against their computer crime law, which implicates, of course, good faith IoT research, where trying to find a hard-coded password on a device that you yourself own is a pretty common form of research. What is the sticking point? I think a lack of understanding and a lack of priority for the states. But that is one area where I think we are hopeful that we'll see states take up a charging policy similar to what we saw with the Department of Justice with the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act as the culture keeps changing.
I have some things I'd like to add to that because I just love it so much. I think a couple things. We even speaking from when I was in the U.S. government at Department of Homeland Security, when we had a case where we had a security researcher come to us and say, "Hey, I'm really concerned about medical device, and I'm really concerned about information leakage over Wi-Fi, essentially, over the communications spectrum, but I can't test it because I live in X state." And I can't test it because I may end up going against some recording, dual, both parties have to consent to be recorded. And it's amazing to me that a hacker knows about a law that may get them, that's pretty high level there. But even as the US government, I couldn't test it. Because of the place that we were located in. So I had to go to another state that doesn't have the same requirements. And we were able to use an FCC testing range to test this vulnerability to see if we could replicate it and if it was actually legitimate. And so there are cases where this is common, and it's these little things that how would you know if you didn't know? And so I think that's kind of where the laws kind of need to pick up to really kind of modernize themselves. I do think there's been a lot of progress in this. So last week, the state of Nebraska put forth a bill saying that they're going to hire security researchers, hackers, to actually test their state infrastructure. And this is this has never happened. And of course, you put forward a bill, like you can imagine how that went down on the floor there. They're putting forth a bill to allow hackers to test their infrastructure, and everybody in the room was probably, oh my gosh, I got aghast. What are we doing? And that's because there's the disconnect. And you said, is it the researchers? Is it the companies? Is it the states? I think it's the population. I think it's the community. I don't think that the technology literacy has gotten to a level where it's not shocking to folks to hear, oh my God, we're going to have hackers test the state infrastructure. This is in my mind, an example of a positive progress in this space, because it's saying there are bad actors who are testing all the time. So if we have the ability to leverage people who, even if they are bad actors, I'm not here to decide who's a goodie and who's a baddie. I'm here to decide whether or not the information they provide me is technologically viable. And if it is, then I want to fix it, right? And so if we remove the who is and who is not, from our calculus completely, and we say somebody is willing to give me information that may help me secure a network, that may help an end user be more secure at the end of the day, I'm willing to accept that because I think the net benefit is there. And so I think once we're making progress, right? But it's still shocking. It's still something that's, oh my gosh, we're going to have hackers test our network. And I think that that's a very bold move on the state of Nebraska, and I commend them for that. I think that was it's a way to be a good leader.
I think some of it, that reaction to your point is the word hacker, and the mythos that's built up around it as being at least somewhat criminal. And I think that this is also encouraged by the hacker community.
They haven't done themselves any favors in that space.
Yeah, they kind of like the image of sort of skating the edge of legality, but it does, I think, also hamper acceptance of the ethical and beneficial aspects of hacking. Hacking is supposed to be a neutral term. We are out to stop malicious hackers, but the work of good faith hackers is beneficial to us all.
Completely agree. We try to make the distinction between criminal and hacker whenever we can. I want to look at some of the trends in how things are delivered in terms of technology. So clearly, cloud is taken over a lot. Most stuff is run as a service, and we see that now through shared services via APIs, applications being built with a lot of stuff, including open source. I don't know if we talked about it before or mentioned during, but certainly AI, right, as another way into perhaps an organization and its systems and its data. How have those changes impacted both sides of the fence? Opportunities for researchers to find more things in an increased exposure field, if you will, and then an organization in terms of how they define the scope within their disclosure program.
So I think that for organizations that are defining the scope of their program, if it's an asset that they want to be protected, and one that they have that back end vulnerability management process overseeing its security, then it's worth their while to have a CVD process that encompasses those assets. And I think it comes down to the individual organization, whether or not they're putting forth the effort to keep that CVD program aligned with their expanding range of services. That includes cloud. That also includes artificial intelligence as they're taking those on. I'd say that at least two trends I'd point out. One is that there are an increasing number of regulations that require it. So organizations, I think, are getting more used to applying this to their services. One example is the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, which is going to apply to all software and IoT, and will require a coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy. The UK just put out something similar for smart connected devices. For AI,
I think.
I'm sorry.
I think that hits this weekend. In fact,
that's right. And these are touching broad swaths of the consumer market, including associated cloud services. Right. So it's not just the physical device you're holding in your hand, but also like the mobile app that it's attached to. It's, conducting remote processing for the regulated device. The other trend that I would point to on AI is that we are seeing the rise of disclosure of not just security vulnerabilities, but things that I would characterize as algorithmic flaws. So bias, discrimination, toxic, and other harmful output like synthetic child pornography, and other items that I think we recognize as important for to mitigate for the responsible deployment of AI, but don't necessarily sit within the sort of security and safety realm that we have built up over the past 9 years. But we're seeing similar processes being put there. So coordinated disclosure that involves bias, discrimination, but also bias bounties. So instead of a bug bounty, it's a bias bounty. In some ways, the law, I think, needs to catch up to that practice, and I think it will.
Does a DMCA come back into play there? Because I'm thinking of copyright information again, producing a new Mickey versus an old Mickey. That's in public domain as an example, right? It
sure does. But it comes into play in ways that a different way than you just described. So DMCA, back to DMCA section 1201, that exception, which in many ways really helped to further the movement to get protections across the ecosystem, is limited to security testing. And so if you are testing AI for something like racial or gender discrimination or synthetic CSAM, is that a security vulnerability? And I think at best, let's just say it's not clear. And that lack of clarity means that we need to have a discussion about the scope of the security testing protections and whether or not they cover these other non-security harms that we agree have to be addressed for trustworthy AI. And that conversation is happening with the Copyright Office right now. Literally wrote something on it today. There's a hearing that's taking place. They're considering a petition for providing protections to researchers that are engaged in that generative AI research. So jury's out on that. We kind of have to see. But certainly there is movement on the testing aspect of it. So generative red teaming and testing AI for both security and non-security. But we don't have yet clarity and specific legal protections for both testing on an independent basis and information sharing the way that we do for security.
Yeah, and I would just add in that, like, I think that I see a lot of fear around AI, and I think maybe that fear is originated in the idea that it provides an unfair advantage to an adversary. And while I will admit that that's correct, I also think that I'm not yet convinced that that's accurate. I don't necessarily think that AI provides an asymmetric kind of capability to an adversary. I think that AI is an enabler. And if we take, I hate to be overly rosy and positive about it, but if we take AI as a net benefit, I mean, machine learning has been in existence for a very long time. There's a very cute little meme recently about AI and little, Microsoft Clippy. So machine learning has been around for a pretty long time. It's becoming more and more advanced, but generative AI kind of was a watershed moment. So it's a little bit more shocking because it's getting more into the public sphere. But I think the capabilities there are startlingly wonderful. And it really does enable a defender equally as much as it enables an adversary. So from the defender perspective, AI allows you to do adversary emulation at a much faster rate. And I think ultimately everything that you've said, down from the original question, looking at services and delivering of services, and what the trends are, I think that everything boils down to it's happening faster. It's happening faster than we thought it would before. So services are at your fingertips now, where you used to have to go and go through several steps in order to access a portal. Now it's just an app on your phone. These things are all being delivered much faster, which means we have to keep up with them faster. And I think that tools like AI allow us to secure the infrastructure faster. So I think it's about how you think creatively. From a security perspective, it's about how you think creatively about using these tools to help protect the infrastructure, just as much as it's about thinking about how an adversary would use these tools to cause harm to the ecosystem.
And Kay, I want to stick with you because we kind of painted a picture that there's a bit of navigation required on the researcher side. You said how impressed, or you can use his words, but it's impressive that a hacker knows the laws and how and where to engage and not. don't think it's all rosy on the service provider side though either. What's feasible, what's not feasible, and it brings to mind to me maybe countering laws, or I'm thinking things like privacy laws, that you might have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program that now you can't have because of some statement in a privacy law that prevents you from doing something. So are there things like that make you reevaluate your current program, think differently about how you create a new one?
So I think that you've hit on something that's very important, and it's the evolution of legal and regulatory compliance. And I think that ultimately, the laws of the nation are set. We can have some participation in identifying implementation and helping to influence the way that the policy is written. I spend a lot of my life being what I refer to as a cybersecurity activist, and I work with policymakers. About 25% of my life is working with policymakers to help inform conversations and inform policy. So if we can write a better policy, then that can be given to an agency to implement safer and better and more efficiently. From an industry perspective, you are always trying to evolve your policies or your programs and your product to make sure that you're staying within what is the accepted kind of legal and regulatory compliance. And it's about doing those things efficiently and at the best value and delivering the best product to the customer ultimately. So I think oftentimes people see regulatory kind of compliance laws and standards as somewhat punitive. And I think it's important to switch our mind around and say, like, there's a net good here. This is why this law or this regulation was created. And I need to see the net good in it. And it may take a little bit for me to adapt my product to be able to comply. But that's always the goal, right? The goal is to deliver a product to a customer that is efficient, valuable, and safe. And you want to do that by being in the conversation and by enabling the conversation and by working cooperatively with the people who are making those policies in the beginning. If you can do that, if you can be active with the people who are writing the standards and the regulations and the artifacts, then you have a much better chance of enabling the correct words, right? And I say this because we started with my definition of the word vulnerability. And the reason that I start with that is because when I was in the government, it was a regular occurrence that I would have to say, I appreciate that you're thinking of vulnerability in this sense, but when you write it like this, it equals that. And that is something that has to be understood. And if we can enable those conversations and enable that writing to be more balanced and more receptive to the needs of today and the needs of tomorrow, more evergreen, then I think we have a much better case and a much better capability to deliver a secure product.
And as we wrap here, I want to, I think it's great points, Katie, because we're talking about finding the good in it, right? And really embracing that. And Harley referenced a couple of laws that kind of nudge us in that direction, right? We're gonna help you find the good in it.
Sometimes that's needed, sometimes there's a balance between a carrot and a stick, and exactly. You got to think past how this impacts me right now and think, how does this impact the good of humanity later? And I think sometimes there's that disconnect. We think it's me right now, but in reality, the ecosystem is so much bigger than me. And sometimes I think people lose sight of that. And it's very important.
And so where I want to go to wrap is, I know there are organizations and standards and frameworks for a lot of stuff in cyber. Are there any things here that organizations can leverage? Things that come to mind are disclose.io or maybe SBOM stuff or CMMC stuff that the government's doing. Are there any things you can reference to help our audience kind of get a handle of how to get started and do this properly?
I have a couple off the top of my head. So, okay, wonderful. So the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams is an international organization. So first.org, they're an international organization, and they are the organization that often sets standards for cybersecurity principles. So for instance, CVSS, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, is set out of FIRST. They have, I think, about 25 special interest groups, and they range from everything from product security incident response to an ethics special interest group to a supply chain. So there's always the opportunity to interact with them. They are a membership, so there is a fee sometimes, but a lot of the SIGs also are pretty flexible, and you can join a SIG without being a FIRST member. The other thing is, from the bug bounty perspective, there is an organization that is bug bounty platform agnostic, and that's the Bug Bounty Community of Interest. And they're made up of managers from multiple different companies that all work in the bug bounty space. And so they're trying to understand and learn from each other about challenges and how to evolve the community in a positive way. Those are the ones that come to mind really quickly. So there are other industry groups. I would say there's always somebody who started down the path, and so don't try to recreate the wheel. Leverage the assistance that's already started for you.
Oh, well, I mean, those are excellent examples. I think that there's also plenty of written guidance out there by both government sources like the Department of Justice, the Department of Commerce. But also from MITRE, Carnegie Mellon, they have good guides on establishing coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes. These practices have been around for quite a long time. There's some excellent standards on them, like ISO IEC 29147 and 30111. They are frequently referenced in regulation and best practices. So I think if you're looking for resources, you're not going to come up short.
Nice one. Well, you probably think you're done once we end this recording, but you'll have one action item at the end, which is to provide a few of those for our folks, and I'll include them in the show notes, so everybody can get a head start on it without doing a search. But fantastic conversation. I know we covered a lot of things from a few different angles. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you think folks should know before we wrap?
Sanctions.
Oh, God.
All right.
Sanctions is my vendetta. That's what really brings it up. Do you want me to bring it up, Harley?
Well, there's two aspects. One, I'll cover one, which is if you're going to be paying a researcher, just like if you're going to be paying a ransom, make sure that there's no indication that it is a sanctioned entity to avoid OFAC sanctions. That is one aspect of your due diligence in working with researchers. Katie, I'll leave the second aspect to you.
Right. So the U.S. government sanctions regime, I'm not going to get into how or why or the motivations. They have a job to do, and I understand that, and I respect that. The problem becomes that there is no legal mechanism for companies to speak with individuals who may be tangentially associated with organizations on the SDN list. Or those that are in embargoed countries. So you have security researchers, especially in an embargoed country. Those folks are often taking a great personal risk on themselves to even be willing to communicate that vulnerability to a company outside of that embargoed country. And so the problem becomes that companies do not even have the ability to receive that information and to respond to that information. So separately, individuals who are tangentially associated to those on the SDN list. So you can take what this means is some folks are named by name on the SDN list. Those folks are not often the kind of people who are reporting cybersecurity vulnerabilities. They tend to be very high-level individuals, high in foreign governments, and they're on a sanctions list for probably a very, very good reason, and that's been an entire investigation that's put them there. But oftentimes there are companies that are also on the SDN list, and those companies, I won't get into the why they're on the SDN list, but if you have an employee who used to work at a company that is on the SDN list, and I have an email address that has, employee1 at sanctionedcompany.com, from a company perspective, from a vendor perspective, I can't speak to that person. because I know that they're on the SDN list. And you can have a normal conversation. You can say, hey, how's the weather in whatever? That's not a sanctioned conversation. But as soon as you say, hey, I received your vulnerability submission that you sent me, the proof of concept, and I'm going through it and I'm looking at it, and are you talking about version 1 or version 1.1? That's now considered a sanctioned conversation. Because you're engaging in what's called technology exchange, and technology exchange is a forbidden act. And so there is no, short of going to the Department of Treasury and securing a license, which takes a lot of time, there is no mechanism for companies to speak with good faith security researchers to clarify and receive that vulnerability information. And I think that there's room for clarification in U.S. government regulations to enable a legal path to be able to receive that good faith security research.
And just to be clear, the situation that Katie's just described does not involve a payment. Right, you just want to receive the vulnerability information. You're not talking about paying anybody that is in any way associated with sanctions. So I think we covered 3 big areas that could be improved for coordinated disclosure, to reduce liability both for the organizations receiving them, but also for the people who are performing them. State laws, figuring out the intersection of AI and these laws, and then sanctions. If I had to identify a top 3, those are, I think, my top 3 right now to move this space forward.
Nice. And of course, it takes all of us, right? A lot of it will be driven by policy and regulation. So share your thoughts with the appropriate folks for that, and understanding how your own business is impacted by these. Certainly be prepared for that would be my advice. Thank you, Katie, Harley. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for listening and watching. Of course, I appreciate you subscribing and sharing and staying tuned for many more. Absolute pleasure having you both on. And hope to catch up with you again soon as the landscape changes, as new trees grow. We'll come back together. Thanks, everybody.
Insights, solutions, and networking all come together at RSA Conference. Join a global cybersecurity community at rsaconference.com/ITSP Mag 24.